All right, welcome back to the Stafford Beer Brain of the Firm reading group. We're continuing to read chapter 17, and we're starting here with the section on the Checo programs. So this, to recap, is covering essentially System 4 stuff, and let's get into it. So Beer writes, the basic tools for handling Systems 3.2.1 information have been discussed. CyberNet and CyberStride. Information about the internal operations of any viable system will, in certain circumstances that were examined in Part 3, be transmitted to Systems 3, 4, 5. But System 4 is charged with the task of providing plans to steer the whole organization, which is not merely the sum of Systems 1 in their particular environments. In the case of a national economy, the environment is firstly the whole of the nation, and not some sector of it, embedded secondly in the environment of the community of all nations. Saying CyberNet and CyberStride cover 3.2.1. There's that linkage between System 3 and then 4 and 5, but System 4 needs to cover the whole of the nation in the case of CyberSyn, which is embedded in the world system. In Chile, there was an institution known as ODAPLAN, an acronym for the National Planning Office, in which in theory reported to the president through a director holding ministerial status. It had little influence in practice. Its methodology was based on that favored by national planners in many parts of the world, and particularly by the Eastern Bloc: input-output analysis. Its work was published and very polished within these terms. But, as one of the core group wrote, in point of fact, it has become an institution dedicated to preparing the national accounts and developing statistical reports. ODAPLAN was not poised to create a true System 4 function any more than the National Office of Statistics and Census could have performed the System 3 function that CyberStride would fulfill. One can find comparable institutions in most countries, and it seems ironic that although they are usually defined, as in Chile, in terms of the 4.3 functions of a viable system, they nowhere embrace a methodology that could conceivably discharge those functions of a viable system. Nowhere means nowhere as far as I know, but I can certainly list some countries other than Chile of which the statement has at some time been true. To my knowledge, to my personal knowledge and indeed distress: Britain, Canada, India, Italy, Denmark, and Jamaica. In fact, the Chilean operative plan mentioned in the last section was under the control of the Budget Office in the Ministry of Finance, which is exactly where one would expect to find the real power. Chapter 13 indicates the route taken via systems models and their simulation that I had successfully argued we should take during the first meeting in Chile. Witness the activity of an economic modeling shown in the PERT chart of Chapter 16. Let the January 1972 report from London, which restated the case, take over the story. It is certainly possible to contemplate the use of large input-output analyses as a means of balancing the Chilean economy, but there are three major problems with this approach. First, matrix models are very poor in structure, since structure can be depicted only by listing constraints on the equations which the rows represent. This is a shortcoming even when the structure is known and accepted. But if, as I take it, an objective is actually to restructure the Chilean economy, this is a poor tool indeed. It is very difficult to introduce stochastic elements into input-output models, yet economic life is a stochastic process. Number 3, Chile is plunged into an epoch of rapid change, and therefore the most important feature of any System 4 representation of the economy should be the adequate reflection of its dynamics. Input-output is deplorably static. I therefore recommend a wholly different approach. We need a simulation model of the industrial sectors and their interactions embedded in an environment that takes account of the investment capability in terms of both foreign exchange and domestic savings. The emphasis will be on structure, which can be changed by inserting new feedback loops, for example, and on the dynamic interplay of the factors modeled, which produces multiplier effects of crucial importance. This model would be used to mediate between the detail of current performance arising from the 3-2-1 monitoring system and the current structural situation as reflected by the operative plan. On the one hand, and the formulation of strategy on the other. System 4, in short, is a mediator between Systems 3 and 5. With a simulator of this kind, we can investigate the nature of the trapped states in which the economy is currently enmeshed, and which appear to be functions of a metasystem that extends beyond the national boundaries. For example, if foreign exchange earnings have been used to support a service sector, supporting in turn the high consumption, low savings pattern of the elite groups to whom they flow, then this would count as a trapped state. When these systems are demonstrated, the effect of single measures, land reform, copper nationalization, will predictably be seen as sufficient in themselves to break out of the traps. Cybernetic considerations certainly suggest that new structure involving new information pathways and harnessing of motivational factors will be needed to achieve Chile's radical political goals. The simulator will be the government's experimental laboratory. Can this be done? The first PERT chart called for a tentative model of this kind by the March deadline. On this timescale, there is only one way into the problem, and that is to make use of the immediately available Dynamo compiler that has been extensively developed over many years by J.W. Forrester of MIT. I have directed 3 projects in the past using this compiler and have found it to be a powerful and flexible tool. Accordingly, I sought out R.H. Anderton, a systems engineer brought up in the aerospace industry who switched to OR and the human sciences, and whose work is referred to in Chapter 13 of Brain. He managed one of the 3 projects just mentioned and is, in my opinion, exponential deleted. So Beer had some kind of positive thing to say about Anderton, but that was removed from the text. He holds a senior job in industry, but is thinking of switching to academic life. We also involved K.A. Gilligan, a mathematical physicist and statistician who went into OR and has been involved in real-time corporate modeling. In this way, the Checo, or Chilean economy research, was born. All right, let's see. So, Jeremy, what would you like to say about this section?
So, Ron Anderton is still around. He's done a lot of work with Elena Leonard. He and she edited an anthology of Stafford's writings called How Many Grapes Went into the Wine. And he also helped create Team's Integrity. And in a lot of books where Stafford invites multiple authors, Ron Anderton is one of the people he invites. So, yeah, he's still around. He's a very, very interesting person.
Cool. Shane, and we'll go to Matt.
Yeah, just like a sort of minor thing. Like, it's interesting that when he's picking on like the input-output modeling, he says that the matrix models are very poor in structure because the structure can only be depicted by listing constraints on the equations. But then in his proposed alternative model, he's also focusing on structure, but the structure is going to be, like, so he says the emphasis will be on structure, which can be changed by inserting new feedback loops, for example. So they're getting a better quality of structure by having this kind of dynamic feedback-based thing, and it's not just like listing a bunch of constraints. It's actually adding feedback loops and adding information flows and tuning both of them that gives you the structure. And it's like, later they're talking about like the need to restructure the economy. So describing the current set of constraints in an input-output table isn't going to do it. You're going to need a model that can dynamically adapt, and like you need to be able to insert new feedback loops, in fact, to possibly be able to make those kinds of changes. It's just it's an interesting emphasis on getting structure from dynamism.
Yeah, and I mean certainly the input-output work that was being done in the Soviet Union at this time was largely academic, and I don't think it was the fact that it was input-output that led to it being irrelevant and academic, but it definitely falls under the same criticisms that Beer levels against the originally existing ODA plan, right? Like it was disconnected from actual policy implementation and not very useful. So there's a similar kind of problem that existed in the USSR, even though the like reasons for its lack of adoption weren't simply technical, but often just driven by political resistance as well. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I also honed in on him talking about how, like, once you're not taking structural things as fixed, like once it's not just a matter of we need trucks to be making return trips in less than X amount of days, and but the driver also has to not be on the road for more than Y hours. You can't necessarily use like the more traditional well optimized operations research tools in the same kind of way. And it's interesting that the simulations were his tool of choice for that. And I'm also getting a sense of this I feel like if I was going to point to one thing that like Beer was like a master of, it's jumping between layers of abstraction and just like using like the right tool for the right job there. Because I mean, like I'm sure like once the right feedback loops are set up, it probably was back to the input-output tables. But I mean, I feel like it's even also reflecting this metrics. I think when you're the very, very baseline was where you're just trying to make sure that week to week, like you're hitting, like what you can do. Like that's probably the input output tables. But while, like you're, I think you're going for, I think the word was latency, like, where you're going from what you've been capable of doing to what's theoretically possible. I think like that's when he goes to like the Dynamo simulations.
Right. So does he say anywhere he was using input output for this project?
I think that's what he means by the matrix things, though. That it's operations research techniques. You're optimizing some quantity or some set of with respect to some constraints.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, but he just criticizes those, right?
Yeah, he says he recommends an entirely different approach. So, I mean, probably learned something from input output, but I mean, yeah.
Well, I mean, is that like when you're just trying to like sort of figure out like more kind of like on the ground details, like and so he like almost certainly still using that, like when he's going from I forget the names of his KPIs, but like when you're just trying to make sure from week to week that and it'll tell you, oh, if it's raining, like you have to make these adjustments, versus like structural things where it probably actually won't tell you like the little detail that you need for certain things. Like you'll probably go back to the operations research models. But if there are structural things like, you need to move to a different tool. Yeah.
So the thing here is that the input-output modeling is insufficient specifically for System 4 stuff. But it could be.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good way to put it, yeah.
Sure, gotcha.
Right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I'm not sure there's clear evidence that that's actually what was done, but I do definitely see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. So in this way, the Checo research was born. It was under the direction in Chile of Mario Grandi. Another Chilean, Hernan Aviles, came to London for training. Obviously, this was a mammoth undertaking, but the first runs of a tentative internal model were being made in June 1972 against the target date of March, and by September there was an experimental model of the economy at the macroeconomic level, which included sub-models of the generation of national income, inflation, and foreign exchange. The light industry Rama and the automotive industry had been chosen at two different microeconomic levels of recursion. Simulations were run for years ahead. They were thought-provoking, but the team saw itself as learning the trade, and no one was anxious to place reliance on the results. Communications with Ron Anderton by this time at Lancaster University and having other commitments were not easy. The development came to a virtual halt after the third epoch, which is covered in the next chapter. Therefore, it does not seem worthwhile to give elaborate details, although these are still preserved. There's one other thing I actually remembered I wanted to talk about regarding the previous section here. So, Beer brings up this discussion of trapped states, and I just wanted to sort of clarify or ask, like, this model, it's the System 4 model that they develop, it's essentially trying to maximize for, is it like GNP that they're working towards? Like, when they're trying to avoid trapped states, it sounds like they're essentially trying to, like, avoid, not capital flight, but, like, well, basically economic dynamics that are draining capital out of the country so that they can maximize national accumulation. Shane, you had something to say?
So I think that's possible. I think I read the trapped state thing as being more generally about the kind of stuff that Ashby talks about, of, like, if you have variables and you make a graph out of them, there's going to be areas of the graph that are like sinks, like that if you fall into the hole, you'll never get out of it. Like, if you transition into this state, you'll probably never get out, which I think capital flight will be an example of a sort of downward slope that you can not realistically return from. And I think what the System 4 thing is trying to do is to optimize for the ability to navigate out and away from trapped states. So, like, you could also imagine, maybe the example is like the centralization, decentralization bounce back and forth that companies get trapped in, where in one tick it's decentralized and the next tick it's centralized, and back and forth and back and forth. That will be a trap. It's an oscillator that jumps between two islands. And the System 4 would want to pull out of that dynamics, that you're getting out of the sinkholes and away from the sinkholes. So I took it to be a bit more general, but those are all concrete, specific examples of the kinds of traps that you'd want to avoid. Because, if you start down the slope towards capital flight, you're not going to come out of it. Similarly, hyperinflation, whatever, you're not going to come out of that. I don't know, nuclear war. You're not going to come back from that. There's all these traps and holes that you don't ever want to fall into.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking here when he says that trap states in which the economy is currently enmeshed and which appear to be functions of a meta system that extends beyond the national boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it sounds to me like they're grappling with, like, trying to remove themselves or respond to relations of dependency, right? Like in world systems, in the world systems theory sense.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So this is mainly about capital accumulation, as far as I can tell, like national capital accumulation.
It's about your landscape being disciplined by the other force, right? That there's this, you're embedded in this other thing, and to go back to the kind of like traps and slopes thing, it's like it's pushing you towards the slope, and your task is to kind of navigate around it in a kind of dynamic way to try and push yourself away. But yeah, it is interesting that they had this like transnational meta system in mind right from the start, right? So that ultimately it's a kind of failed project because it's just localized to one small island. But there's the hints there of like the indication that you would need the kind of McNair sort of like continental majority sort of thing to actually really escape that trap. Because if your power ends at the border and your everything inside the border is disciplined by this system that's outside the border, then that's an extremely difficult situation to even begin to navigate around.
Yeah. But I mean, again, you can only sort of operate at the level of recursion you can operate at, and they're trying to adapt to their environment. Tom, and then Jake.
Yeah, like I assume it's just like you guys have, maybe Jeremy or somebody will know more than this, but I assume it's just like kind of basic, like what today is called econometrics models that they're trying to design. I don't know how good econometrics was at the time, but I think the idea with these trap states as well would be to say, like, let's say they want to model us, say, having problems getting foreign currency, and then within our model, seeing what parameters you could push to, say, counterbalance that. So not so much just to identify where the traps are, but also seeing like what are exit strategies from them. I would also say like that, you don't ever get stuck in these traps forever, like, because other things happen, like war, debt relief, even hyperinflation. It goes to a critical point. You just launch a new currency, So, I wonder how, like, my whole problem with this Checo program is like, how do you model for the CIA? Is there, where do you put your CIA function into the econometric model? And it's really, really non-linear stuff that you can't even put you can put one, but like, how do you design a non-linear function for like CIA interference? It's like, how the fuck knows how you model that? And you need that in this model.
Right. If it's to perform a proper system for a function, you need it. Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, I think people have kind of touched on how I feel like he's trying to talk, like what he's meaning when he talks about like those states that people get stuck, or that these systems get stuck in. But I think, just to touch on that, like, yeah, like a true system 4 is adaptable to the point where it's not just going on. It's not just like sort of what's the word, like course, like coasting on the sort of inertia from here's how things were done. That's the whole point of like Beer's, like the VSM of everything, and it's like trying to not take for granted everything that exists in how organizations are set up, but like actually thinking about, well, what's the most efficient and like actually capable way of doing this. And we've been talking about, like, in past sessions, like what does a system for, like, what do these models look like? What are the metrics that you use to measure, like, an organization, socialist organization or an economy? Like, what are those things that take into account the really, like, the unknowns? And, I would say partially, like, just thinking about, I've just been reading this union organizer's handbook for the Amalgamated Transit Union that someone sent me, and it talks about how unions so rarely invest in organizing new workers and new industries even, and that idea of, like, well, if what's the way out of what's the way against the CIA? Like, how do you plan against it? It's to, like, create new seeds for this VSM to sprout in other places so that it can't be, like, stamped down if a fascist coup occurs because of CIA meddling, and clearly, like, they weren't prepared for that. I mean, it's fucking tough to prepare for that, and especially given the time constraints and economic constraints and all that stuff. But, like, to have, like, a true lasting proletarian, like, system 4, system 5, that sort of thing, like, it requires that kind of flexibility of tactics and, like, understanding that growth in a meta sense, not just, like, growth for growth's sake or growth, like, along the, like, metrics that, these, like, input output, like, things we're measuring before, like, those were clearly not working. And it's kind of, yeah, I mean, it kind of all comes down to, like, what are the ways to measure these things? And I don't fucking know, but it's interesting to think about. And like Beer is saying, and I'd like to think it's true, is that there are those things exist, but it's just a matter of finding them, measuring them, modeling them, and, like, integrating them.
Yeah, and Shane?
Yeah, like, kind of maybe riffing on both what Jake and Tom have been saying. I suspect that the whole question of, like, oh, how do you model the CIA is that you don't, right? Like, that, I think the proper instantiation of a system 4 would have to be clusters of human brains and discourse and dialogue. Because I have a suspicion that trying to formalize these things in computer systems is probably not going to work out, because you'll always have this problem of, like, how do you specify the thing well enough to be able to compute it? And if natural matter itself is always the best computer of its own state, like, when I read some of this stuff, I kind of almost suspect that Beard didn't quite drink his own Kool-Aid hard enough on this point. That because, like, even in the World War II, like, operations room, when they were trying to predict the paths of airplanes, they ended up just using expert pilots. They would sit them in a chair and have them look at the data readouts, and then they would sit there and stare at them and go, "They're going to turn north," and that's just their instinct, right? Because, like, the brain is the computer that does that. And the reason for that was that those expert pilot brains were vastly better at computing that result based on this fuzzy data. They were better than they could have ever expected a computer to be, because they would have to then formalize what the pilot was doing, which would become sort of impossible, right? It's kind of irreducible. So I think the right way to do this system 4 stuff is to basically, you have, like, layers, like systems 1, 2, and 3 be computerized and automated. But then systems 4 and 5 have to be extremely organic, which is an inversion of the usual technocracy angle, where the lower levels are organic and they're in service of a machine god above them. I think in the ideal sort of cyber communist sense, it's the machines who are subservient to an organic god above them. And this system 4, 5, like, hyper intelligence process has to be clusters of organic brains. In order for it to get any kind of a grip on problems like the CIA, which I think are just not computable in that sense.
Well, I mean, they're not computable in the sense that, like, the model isn't going to cover CIA strategy, but they like, the model could still be useful for exactly what they used it for, right? Like, oh, they've organized this trucker strike, so what's the consequences of that, right? And then, the model will tell you where the pain points might be that you need to respond to. I
guess the difficulty is always going to be that the model will cover the stuff that you've told the model to cover, and that's kind of going to be stuff that you're already already have a grip on. But the unforeseen stuff is, I think, it will jump out to a brain faster than it will jump out to a computer.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's why you need to kind of work in conjunction with what the model can do.
The Centaur sort of arrangement, yeah, certainly.
Tom?
Yeah, I just think like a lot of people have kind of, I don't know what's the word, like a model fetish, and it's something to be very wary of, that you can use them as guides, but they're only as good as the person who's building them. I've just literally been watching one on econophysics for econophysics, and some of the modeling was just rubbish. They give you a similar output graph to what you want, but the logic behind them is just, it's arbitrary. So like you got to be quite careful about the choice of model. I also think like the fact that this part wasn't really a success, Beer himself he's not a Marxist or like somebody who understands like say like Lenin, or somebody who understands like what the bourgeois are capable of, how they can destroy your economy. It's kind of no surprising that all these guys are working for Anderson Consulting and thinking, oh yeah, this is just like modeling, the Belgian economy, blah blah blah. It's.
Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, and then I think one of the takeaways for like what tended to work and what tended to not was someone said earlier, it's Shane said it's systems one to three. The communication was always like the big thing that really affected things, and even like the more computational stuff, as far as I can tell, was really more about integrating like multiple information streams so that it was consumable by a human. Because that's one of the things the computer can do that, like a person reasonably can't, just take streams from, a whole bunch of different factories and, turn that into actionable insights. And so I know, in terms of, in terms of like the trucker strike, it was the coordination and communication stuff. And, off the top of my head, if I'm going to think about how to model the CIA. On the one hand, you probably actually could think of certain things to even like put into your model of just like, okay, sabotage is something that they can do. Going into the military is something that they can do, and maybe if they'd gone a little bit further, I don't know how much what the state of like social network analysis models were at this point. They might not have existed, but seeing how likely each officer is to work for the U.S. and seeing who their friends are and stuff, like you can do that. But probably like most important than anything, more important than anything else, would actually probably have just been like the coordination thing, because I feel like what the way the coup actually succeeded was by breaking coordination. Like as far as I can tell, constitutional loyalists plus like actual socialists, combined actually were the majority in the military. It's just that partially they got very lucky. They took a very big gambit. But if the loyalists and if the liberals and socialists had been able to like coordinate around something, and maybe even with groups like Mirror and the other leftist militias, I think that day would have turned out differently. And so that would probably be if I can go back in time, create like a red phone where Mir can call Moneda and vice versa, and which officers either because they just don't think coups are a good idea because they live in a pretty stable democracy really, or they themselves are Marxists. Have bat phones and have ways that everyone can get in communications. Ideally, ones that are hard to disrupt.
Right. Yeah. Jeremy, go ahead.
Beer was very interested in assembling these sort of multidisciplinary teams, and you kind of wish he'd had video game designers with him, because he was trying to play the game in normal mode when the game was really being played in hell mode. And the system didn't really take hell mode into account. If there'd been game designers in the system, they'd be like, okay, well, what if orcs climb up through the sewers and start stabbing everyone with pikes? Like, you'd come up with ways to, how could this get completely messed up? I mean, another point to bring up is the Communist Party of Chile was very critical of Allende for not arming the workers. And there were other radical groups that weren't the Communist Party itself. There's a really interesting book people should read called Chile, The Guerrillas Are Amongst Us by Hielos Prieto. That's a really angry, exasperated critique of Allende coming from much further left. Saying all the times, it's kind of like in the USA we're seeing right now, the Democrats dealing with the Republicans, where they're like, I'm sure we can find some reasonable Republicans who we can reach out to and sort of make deals with, when it's not like that. And I think Allende really believed that if he obeyed the law, was a strict constitutionalist, and did everything the right way, that it was going to work. And that those constraints were more important to him than winning. But he also was aware, I mean, the object lesson of, say, the Bolsheviks, where winning was more important than following the rules, with the result being the rules went out the window and things got very nightmarish. So I think it's very complex about that. But yeah, there were people in Chile who understood this, who were very critical of the way things played out.
Yeah, fair enough. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, the other takeaway would be, and I guess, having a relationship between, Marxist officers and left-wing militias is, I guess, a sub thing of this. But yeah, I mean, constitutional disloyalty in general, like not like, playing like these rules as if, as if like they matter, and having a purely like cost-benefit analysis and mentality in terms of like, okay, what rules can I get away with breaking? Just not engaging good faith. Just always looking for that little bit of advantage. Like it doesn't just mean that you can just change the government overnight, because if you do it too quickly, they have ways of smacking you. But always keeping an eye out for how can I organize the working class better, or just like make like a more stable, like a powerful workers movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure you want to always approach things in terms of pure instrumental reason, but because you as Jeremy said, you end up in a situation where norms degenerate, and you may actually lose your morale overall. But it's worth considering where you can cut the corners, because if you just stick to the rules constantly, and your opponents obviously aren't, you are going to get outmaneuvered, because they know what you will not do, and it's easy to work around that. All right, so let's return to the rest of this discussion of Checo and its failures.
Last paragraph on 267, I think it begins with secondly.
Yeah, I don't think we've done the second to last paragraph yet either.
Yes, actually, you're right. That's quite true.
In the first place, so I'll just start here. But while the Checo team was undertaking these experiments in the spirit of a prolegomenon, that's a tough word, prolegomenon to a full-bodied System 4. I had certain drives of my own to discuss with Mario Grandi and often his team on a short-term basis. In the first place, study was required of the dissemination of results, when they were obtained, of any national model to the sectors, of any sectorial model to the enterprises, and so on, down to the workers' committees. The problem of recursivity in the viable system had not been solved for System 4, although it had been for System 3. See Project Cybersyn later. The Checo team set out to study these issues, and with some success. There was nothing to block their progress, and they were a well-balanced interdisciplinary team, which included a psychologist, and which other national planning group could boast such an active member. Had the work gone on, much would have come of this initiative, as the perusal of the later sections will imply. Secondly, the real reason for a lack of confidence in the results of the simulations that were coming out was not that the team was inexperienced, as their humility declared, but that the data were untrustworthy. As is usual with national figures, they were out of date, and also as usual, they were differentially lagged. Too little attention has ever been paid to these and associated dangers in the origins and development of dynamo simulations that have achieved worldwide attention and continue to do so. Obviously, my own plan was not to rely on such national statistics anymore. I wanted to inject information in real time into the Checo programs via Cyberstride. Thus, any model of the economy, whether macro or micro, would find its base and make its basic predictions in terms of aggregations of low-level data, as has often been done. But Checo would be updated every day by the output from Systems 1, 2, 3, and would promptly rerun a 10-year simulation, and this has never been done. This was one of my fundamental solutions to the creation of an effective 3-4 homeostat. It remains so, but it remains a dream unfulfilled. Thirdly, and despite the professionally admonitory warnings of the Checo team, I needed any indications that I could get in addressing the problems discussed under the later topic heading externalities. I did get such indications. Time did not permit the fructification of the plans made under this heading, but I have no reason to think, with hindsight, that the indications of the Checo simulations were misleading. So essentially this loop between Systems 1, 2, 3 and System 4 was not effectively closed. It's the information from System 4 was not going down to System 1, and also the information that was being collected from the lower level systems was collected asynchronously and was collected out of date, and also you would have some data coming in on time and other data coming in later. So it was not a real-time information stream that was flowing up to System 4. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting that that's just a classic feedback loop breakdown. There seems to be a bootstrapping problem here specifically, that the timely delivery of data didn't already exist, and the sort of mechanisms for dissemination of the results didn't already exist. And so I think this kind of indicates that you would need to, this would probably be a lot easier to do now, because you wouldn't be just going on a cold start and with fairly primitive technology. But you would need to have these tight feedback loops already in place, even if they're not doing very much, so that the timeliness and the kind of up-down feedback of pushing your results back out to the economy and to the workers, and then pulling back in again, pushing out, pulling in, that needs to be pretty damn fast. And you'd probably need, it's like a prefigurative thing. You need some kind of ramp up onto that, so that you don't have oh, hey, look, we got to do a whole new thing from fucking scratch. And oh, we don't have any of the data, we can't get it fast enough. And also we don't yet have a culture of workers receiving this kind of feedback in real time. Those all kind of need to be built up before you get to this point, and they couldn't do it before that point. So I don't know. It's it seems kind of obvious why it would fail.
Yeah, and I mean, if you go back to the previous section of the book, or the 2 sections back, and you look at the physiology stuff, you know, System 4 is supposed to be receiving multiple information streams, right? Like, it's a very connected system, and what they set up here was really not that. You know,
it's also notable that, like, in an organism, it's not like the embryo grows and then at the very end a System 4 gets bolted onto it. Like, it has to be present all the way through to direct the development. Even when it's doing very little, it still has to do it.
Yeah,
and it's muscle up and build up this kind of thing. So it goes from very little to doing a lot, but it can't just be like plugged onto something that's already there. And kind of expected to take over, which means that for us there's a prefigurative element to this, that like we have to get practice in the proletariat at being able to do this. That also means practice at being able to respond very quickly to directives, which also means trust, right? You have to have workers' organizations that you can actually trust, that when, you know, the alarm signal goes up and it's like, quick, fuck, let's move, do this thing, you can actually kind of just do it and trust that you're not getting fucked over by some bureaucrat. There's a lot of prefiguration necessary there to make all that work.
Right. Okay. Yeah, so the System 4 attempt, you know, Beer talks a lot in Brain about how System 4 is very likely to fail, and fail it did. It was not a success in Project Cybersyn. Okay, so then we get to the operations room, which I think we can talk. We can probably get through this section, I think.
I mean, there's very little to it. It's mostly a description of how janky it was. It's a descriptive thing of like, oh, we use shitty projectors, whatever. I'm not, unless somebody. I mean, we can scan it to see is there anything.
No, I mean it's a lot of that. So, I'll just read the intro, and then we'll kind of like talk about some of these particulars. In Chapter 13, a basic design was given for an operations room. We built it in Santiago, according to that specification, with the exception of the use of a hybrid computer there advocated for economic simulation. So they did not have the computer as part of this room. Because they only had one computer. As previously explained, we used the digital program Dynamo to begin the Checo investigations because it already existed and we were in a hurry. But a subcontract was initiated in Britain because the analog hardware could not be found in Chile to pursue the hybrid idea. It did not come to fruition. Basically, the reason was that the research group were waiting for the Checo team to reach conclusions about the models they were constructing before they themselves could do very much. So, from what I remember, this was like a partially analog system, and obviously that means that a lot of the functions have to be like hard-coded into the system, and you cannot just like reprogram them on the fly because they're like literally wired in. This is like in the circuit board itself. Like you can't just like change it. So if the Checo team didn't know what the hell they were doing, then there's no sense in building an analog computer to implement a poorly designed model. Jake, you had something to say?
I think we can probably skip over this, but I just wanted to mention one thing, which is the paragraph at the top of 270, where he talks about the system uses 5 knobs rather than a numbering system with big hand controls, large knobs with strong springs that can be thumped. Once more, this room was a prototype room for use by workers' committees and not a sanctum sanctorum for a governmental elite. I think that's the only important bit in the in this little section, because it's like you want it to feel tactile, to feel like you're actually moving the things with your actions, not just like, like it's very easy, especially now as things have become even more like abstracted via like screens, like touch screens. It's like, you're moving this slider up, but it doesn't feel like you're moving anything. And so it's like, are you really like feeling that by your actions, you're like moving a part of the economy? Not unless you can like slam your hand down on a button and be like, no, I want it this way. Let's try it this way. I think that that kind of visceral, like human feeling of like moving things with your hands and like manipulating things is like cool, and we should bring that back. And and I also liked him talking about like it's a place for workers' committees. Like it's not some like elite government bureaucrats who like change numbers on paper and like shuffle paper around. It's like people can come in, you can move stuff, and things change, and you can learn that. And it's not a secret, and it's not like coded in this like really obscure like legal language or all these like you think you need to know this, like read this book before you can manipulate these things. Like I really like that he talks about like this is a simple thing that is managing a huge complex system, but the point is that it's simple enough that anyone could conceivably use it, and that it should be able to basically be like, I could see this kind of thing becoming like, I like the idea of this of the whole control system being something that you can like internalize and like turn to instinct as quick as possible, so that you can really utilize the fact that we've got these like biological brains that are so much more complex than anything we can like program. It's just a matter of like, translating the language, the meta language of the system into something that your brain recognizes very easily, which like tactile controls do that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this kind of reminds me of like the interactive displays you'll find in a science museum, right? Like they're designed to be operated by children and to be durable enough that they can be abused by children. So, and they're usually very tactile. But yeah, I mean, I think also like you can point to sort of like hybrid synthesizers that use all these like knobs and stuff as like controllers that are very tactile and people enjoy using, even though the back end is all digital. It's more enjoyable. It's more intuitive than like clicking buttons and like interacting with these on-screen facsimiles of buttons and sliders and all that stuff. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, it's like I think we could learn a lot from like musical instruments and stage hardware. There's like a lot of lessons have been learned on how to make these like tactile performance instruments and gear, even like your sort of Ableton like button pads and stuff, but make them in such a way that they can stand up to absolutely horrific abuse on the road and on stage, but still function. And the maybe the ultimate sort of interface for this thing is like an Evangelion sort of thing where you get your fucking brain plugged into it. But this bit about it being
Elon Musk is on it. Don't worry.
Yeah,
he's got it figured out. No worries.
It's gonna be the worst. But this thing with the workers, like the emphasis on the workers, reminded me of like being Jake's story. Reminded me as well of like I know a guy who like worked in like machine and tooling for like a factory making cattle feed, and like they installed a new computer with like this touchscreen interface, and it was like, I mean, it was still industrial stuff, right? But it was like the kind of touchscreen that like a Nintendo DS has. It's the resistive one rather than the capacitive one, so it's a little bit tougher anyway. But the guys would just come up to it with like screwdrivers and like tack to like bunch in the numbers. You'd come running over like, fuck, don't do that. You're gonna fucking break it immediately. But yeah, it's like if you're sort of in the flow of your work and stuff, you're not gonna fucking pause to like.
It's a stylus. It's a stylus thing. Don't worry about it.
It's a Phillips head screwdriver. But the thing has to be able to stand up to the kinds of use that it's going to get with people. Also, there was, I don't know, one tiny detail that jumped out at me from a previous bit, that some of the two screens they put up are alerting signals for this enterprise and for all the child enterprises. So you get to see the alerts for me and for all those subsidiaries that I'm responsible for, which seems like a really nice way to lay all that out.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's go to Matt and then Brett.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Moscom, I've heard like multiple people, both on the aerospace side and on like the user experience side, that are just horrified by the idea of like the fact that SpaceX has touchscreens, which is like there's reasons why they don't, why they don't put touchscreens in like actual aircraft, like as useful as it is for them to be flexible, like if you need to be able to make like split second, like no mistakes decisions, like the joysticks and stuff, like they developed the way they did, like for a reason. But also like I love this concept for this part, because I do think that's like an important version of like removing the distinction between mental and manual labor, democratizing access for everyone to the ability to optimize your job. Everyone can go to the place and see, what happens if I if I do this like with this variable or whatever, and including even potentially like building their own interfaces and tools and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. You certainly imagine that a system like this might be hackable at the work site. Wouldn't be too hard to swap things in and out. Brett, go ahead.
Well, I was going to give another example too. It's not like industrial workers are not used to using advanced tooling. I mean, if you look in the interior of any tractor cab made in this year, you're going to see all kinds of computers and columns with little funny little knobs, and it's actually rather advanced. But it also like the thing is moving around and it's picking up like corn, right? But I mean, it also shows the other side of what you shouldn't do, which is you should have a right to repair, you should have a right to hack it, which is something that none of these modern tractors have. They're all controlled by John Deere, unfortunately. So there's something else to think about.
Yeah. You would certainly you would want to make this a hackable system, because I mean, if the end users can modify it, then you can spread those innovations. Because it's good to start with a design team of professional designers, but you can't assume that they're going to produce a final design that will be ultimate in all situations. Having these monitors in the room and stuff, I imagine that some work teams might want to move them around, and they might want to add some extra buttons or all kinds of things like that, and none of that would be too hard to do as long as you kept things open, publish the spec, that kind of stuff. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe just on the hackable and replaceable thing. Again, I think the world of musical instruments can tell us a lot about there. So drums, right? The drum shell is an expensive instrument, but the drum heads, the skins, are completely replaceable. They're designed to be replaced pretty frequently, and the hardware that bolts them down and stuff is just they're all standard screws and stuff. So I think that kind of industry has learned a lot about the parts of the thing that matter for the core of the thing, and then the parts that are just treated as replaceable and hackable, right? Even the sort of electronic and electrical hardware has a long history of user modifications and hacking to make it sort of fit the scenarios. But yeah, we could probably learn a lot about if you're going to be able to smash a button or whatever with your hand, you're probably going to have to treat it like a drum head, where it's going to be something that'll wear out after.
Look at arcade cabinets, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, all the buttons on those are
smashable.
You can just switch them out. Yeah.
And switchable, easy to switch in and out. Yeah, you just lift up the panel and swap them in and out. Just pop in and out and hook up the wires. Matt, go ahead.
thinking about how, like, one of the reasons why, tech careers are some of the more accessible ones for people with disabilities, is because, I think partially because, you can customize your interfaces and your tools in ways that, compensate for, like, what you specifically have trouble with. And so, like, I think, with a combination of, like, modular hardware designs and, maybe 3D printing, that could be added to other professions, where you really can, set up your own tools and, like, automate little parts of it that, that you have trouble with. I think that would be, that'd be dope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. So some other stuff that's interesting in this section. I like that they did the algedonic signals with the flashing red lights, but they dispensed with the ringing of bells. Turns out that the red alert whining that you hear, the klaxon you hear in Star Trek, is actually more irritating than it is useful. So that's pretty funny. Other things, they ended up building their like prototype room in the Reader's Digest building. So Reader's Digest obviously is like, I don't know if it's even around anymore, but it was this like extremely reactionary middle-brow publication, and so they turned those offices into the nerve center of the Communist Project, which is pretty amazing, especially considering that they were the ones who first published The Road to Serfdom. Like, it was a collaboration between them and Hayek. So I love that. Let's see. They talk about the screens, really bizarre stuff, like really just hacked together solutions. So he talks a lot about how, like, he's not really into the idea of using video screens because they're too hard to read. And, like, I'm imagining, like some kind of CRT operating at like 240p at best, with like a flickery screen, really low refresh rate, really low resolution, and he's like, forget that, just use an electromagnetic switcher, like those clickety-clack signs that you see in train stations or airports, instead of using a really low res monitor that people are going to have to like squint to try to read, which honestly seems like a pretty good solution, given the limitations of display technology at the time. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, that's the thing that strikes me about this. Is like so much of these limitations are just completely blown away by what we have available now. It's like if you look at the picture of the room that they had, and like the way the chairs are arrayed, and you can see those screens on the back, on the walls that are visible. And yeah, if they just had like a 6-inch fucking CRT or whatever on that wall, it'd be completely illegible. And they wouldn't be able to have a screen the size of the thing you can see in the picture and have it actually work well. But today, there's no reason to not just have the whole fucking wall be screen. Like, you can just
make it like a flexible OLED display and
trivial,
have one gigantic screen across the whole wall.
So they're definitely working within the constraints of what they had. And there's a lot of that I don't think is applicable. It's like you still need to make the thing legible, which means cranking up the font size or whatever on the display. But just have the whole wall, have every wall be LCD displays.
Right. So there's projectors that were used. I mean,
they had like back projectors.
Yeah.
To project onto the screens from behind.
Yeah. this like a lexical screen, which is essentially like they had like a folder tree kind of design to it, which is like, okay, well, that's pretty familiar to everyone who's been using, you know, a computer since Windows 3.1. But the Checo screen, they were gonna have like they were gonna have like data projections that were like kind of like what you would see on like a seismograph with like multiple pen heads on moving paper. So just like, yeah, you know, like a drawing on a long feet of paper to see, you know, line goes up, line goes down, that kind of stuff. Again, obviously irrelevant in our current time. So yeah, I mean, they were designing around a lot of technical limitations, and as I think was said, it's really this idea of making a prototype that would be useful on the in the workspace and would be durable is really the most interesting outcome, aside from the stuff that we already covered in the previous section, where the sort of the ideas for this were laid out. This is what we actually got. Okay, so the next section will be on Project CyberSyn as a whole, and I think that's going to take us pretty much through to the end of the chapter.
Up to 278. I think 278 is the beginning of the People Project as a section.
Okay.
So that's about 8 pages, maybe 7.5 pages.
All right, so next time we'll probably focus on CyberSyn, maybe get to some of the People Project stuff. But yeah, we're getting through this. It's you know, pretty soon we'll be done chapter 17, so that's good. Yeah.
Looks like we're going to be at this for the rest of the year.
Yeah. No, I think so. I think we'll finish towards the end of the year in terms of getting through chapter 20 and all that stuff. So yeah, thanks everybody.
Have you been up all night?
Yes, I was not all night, but the previous evening I was up until 6 a.m. So that was not good. So
you're taking speed again? Are you on the speed again?
I'm not on speed. I'm just on insomnia. So
speed might help you actually.
Yeah,
that's what I call it. I'm insomniac. That's what I call it.
Right.
It's the goofballs.
Oh, fun.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. We're going to get into the big picture stuff of CyberSyn next time, and I'll see you then.
Fantastic. See y'all. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.